The rain didn't just fall that night. It washed away everything I thought my life would be. I stood outside his house with nothing. No home, no money, no future. 3 years of marriage, gone with a signature. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't leaving alone. And 2 years later, that secret would come back to destroy everything he thought he had. He ended their marriage with a signature and walked away with everything. The sound of the pen hitting paper was the only thing that broke the silence, a small, ordinary sound that carried the weight of something final. In that moment, everything they had built together was reduced to ink and legal language, stripped of emotion, stripped of meaning. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. To him, it was necessary, efficient, and long overdue. She left with nothing. No money, no home, no future. Just a suitcase in her hand and a life that no longer had direction. The world she had stepped into through him disappeared just as quickly as it had come, leaving her standing alone with questions she wasn't ready to answer. Everything she had given, every sacrifice she had made, suddenly felt invisible, as if it had never mattered in the first place. But what he didn't know, what he never thought to ask, was that she was carrying a secret that stayed hidden in the quiet moments, in the spaces where no one was watching, growing steadily while he moved on without a second thought. A secret that would come back and change his life forever. 2 years later, he saw her again, and standing beside her was a child that looked exactly like him. How did she go from nothing to building a life without him? The question sat heavy in Daniel Carter's mind as he stood frozen in that boardroom, surrounded by voices that suddenly felt distant and unimportant. Just 2 years ago, Emily Harper had walked out of his life with a single suitcase and no safety net. Yet now she stood across from him composed, confident, and completely out of reach. The transformation didn't make sense, not to a man who measured success in numbers, timelines, and calculated outcomes. There was no equation that explained how someone he had dismissed so easily could return stronger than ever, carrying a presence that demanded attention without asking for it. Why did she keep the biggest secret of all? That question struck deeper, more personal, cutting through the logic he relied on. Because standing beside her was not just a child, but a reflection of something he could not deny. The resemblance was undeniable, unsettling in its clarity, forcing him to confront a possibility he had never considered. Every memory of their final days together began to replay in fragments. Moments he once brushed aside now carrying a weight he could no longer ignore. Had there been signs he missed, or had he simply chosen not to see them? And when he finally found out the truth, would it destroy him, or give him a second chance? The answer wasn't waiting in the room, and for the first time in years, Daniel found himself without control over what came next. This was no longer about business or decisions made behind closed doors. This was something far more personal, something that reached into a past he thought he had closed for good. And as the silence stretched between them, one thing became clear. The story he believed had ended 2 years ago was only just beginning. A story of betrayal, survival, and redemption. Long before the silence, before the signatures and the distance that would eventually define them, Daniel Carter and Emily Harper met in the most ordinary way. It wasn't dramatic or planned. Just a brief moment in a crowded office elevator where two strangers exchanged a glance that lingered longer than expected. Emily was ambitious, independent, and determined to build something meaningful for herself. She worked long hours, not because she had to, but because she believed in what she was building. Daniel, on the other hand, was already operating in a different world. Powerful, wealthy, and driven by results. He carried himself with a certainty that made people listen when he spoke. When he noticed Emily, it wasn't just her presence that stood out. It was the fact that she didn't seem impressed by his. That difference drew him in. What started as casual conversations turned into dinners, then weekends, then something neither of them questioned too deeply because it felt right in the moment. Daniel introduced Emily to a life she had only imagined from a distance. Private events, high-rise views, a world where everything moved faster and looked better on the surface. Emily adapted quickly, learning how to navigate spaces that once felt unfamiliar. And in those early months, their connection felt genuine. He admired her independence, She admired his ambition. Together, they seemed balanced, like two people building something that made sense. The wedding came sooner than most expected. It was elegant, carefully planned, and attended by people who saw them as a perfect match. For a while, it looked like they were. The photos captured smiles, laughter, and a future that seemed secure. But what those moments didn't show was how quickly things began to shift once the celebration ended. Daniel returned to his routines, longer hours, constant travel, and a focus that left little room for anything outside of his work. Emily tried to adjust, convincing herself that this was temporary, that success demanded sacrifice, and that things would eventually settle. But they didn't. Conversations became shorter. Time together became rare. Emily found herself waiting for moments that never came, holding on to the version of Daniel she had first met, while the man in front of her grew more distant with each passing week. She gave up parts of her own life slowly, stepping away from her career, her routines, even her independence, believing that supporting him was enough to keep their relationship intact. But Daniel never asked her to sacrifice. He simply expected it. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. The apartment, the events, the image they presented to the world. But inside, something was already breaking. Not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly, in ways that are harder to notice until the damage is already done. Emily felt it in the silence, in the way he no longer looked at her the same way, in the absence of the small things that once made their relationship feel real. And Daniel, whether he realized it or not, had already started to disconnect, replacing emotion with routine and connection with convenience. By the time Emily began to question what was happening, the distance between them had already grown too wide to ignore. She told herself it was a phase, that every relationship had moments like this, but deep down, there was a growing sense that something wasn't right. She just didn't know how far it had gone. And then, one evening, without warning, she overheard something she was never meant to hear. The words didn't come all at once. They slipped through the half-closed door in fragments, quiet at first, almost easy to dismiss, until they formed something undeniable. Emily had been walking down the hallway when she heard Daniel's voice, calm and controlled, the same tone he used in meetings, the same tone that once made her feel safe. But this time there was no warmth in it. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking about her. And with every sentence, the foundation she had been standing on began to give way. He said the marriage had been a mistake. Not in anger, not in frustration, but as a conclusion he had already accepted. He said it wasn't working, that it never really had, and that he should have ended it sooner. There was a pause, followed by something that cut deeper than anything else. He called her replaceable. The word echoed in Emily's mind long after the call ended, long after the silence returned. Replaceable, as if everything she had given, everything she had sacrificed, could be erased and substituted without consequence. To him, the marriage was a mistake. To her, it was everything. Emily didn't confront him right away. She stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to process what she had just heard, hoping there was some explanation that would make it less real. But when she finally stepped into the room and asked him directly, Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't hesitate or attempt to soften the truth. He simply confirmed it, as if honesty in that moment was enough to justify the damage it caused. He told her that things had changed, that he had outgrown the relationship, and that ending it was the most logical decision. Logical. That word again. Always logical. Emily searched his face for something, anything that resembled the man she had married. But what she saw instead was distance. Finality. A decision that had already been made long before she had the chance to respond. She asked him if there was someone else. He said no. That somehow made it worse. Because it meant this wasn't about betrayal in the traditional sense. It was about indifference. About choosing to walk away simply because he could. The days that followed felt unreal. Conversations were reduced to logistics. Timelines replaced emotions. Daniel spoke about the future as if she was no longer a part of it, outlining next steps with the same efficiency he applied to every other aspect of his life. Emily listened, but the words blurred together, overshadowed by the realization that nothing she said would change his mind. Whatever they had once shared was no longer enough to keep him there. 3 weeks later, she was handed divorce papers that would leave her with nothing. The room was quiet in a way that made every movement feel heavier than it should have been. Emily Harper sat across from a polished desk, the surface so clean it reflected the stack of documents placed neatly in front of her. The attorney spoke in a measured tone, explaining each clause as if it were routine, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this meeting began. Daniel Carter sat a few feet away, composed, focused, and detached, occasionally glancing at his watch as though this was simply another appointment to get through before moving on to something more important. There was no tension in his posture, no hesitation in his expression. To him, this was business. No alimony, no support, no second chance. The prenuptial agreement signed years earlier without much thought now dictated everything. Every sacrifice Emily had made, every step she had taken away from her own life to fit into his, was reduced to a technicality she could not challenge. The words on the page were clear, leaving no room for negotiation. She would walk away with exactly what she had brought into the marriage, which was almost nothing. The reality of it settled in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet realization that there would be no safety net waiting for her on the other side of that door. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't push for more or less. He simply agreed to what had already been outlined, his focus fixed on efficiency, on closure, on moving forward without delay. When it was time to sign, Emily picked up the pen with a steady hand. Even though everything inside her felt unsteady, she didn't read the pages again. There was no point. Whatever had been written there had already taken everything it needed from her. The final signature marked the end of something she had once believed would last a lifetime. And just like that, it was over. No dramatic exit. No last attempt to fix what had broken. Just silence, followed by the sound of paper being gathered and filed away. Hours later, she stood alone in the apartment that no longer belonged to her. The space felt unfamiliar now, stripped of meaning, as if it had already erased her presence before she had the chance to leave. The walls that once held memories now felt empty, reflecting a life that no longer existed. A single suitcase sat by the door, holding what little she was allowed to take with her. She paused for a moment before stepping out, taking one last look at everything she was leaving behind. Not just the apartment, not just the life she had built there, but the version of herself that had believed in it. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't leaving alone. 3 days after the divorce, she found out she was pregnant. It wasn't something Emily Harper expected, and at first, she didn't even want to believe it. The signs had been there, subtle, easy to dismiss in the middle of everything she had just gone through. Stress, exhaustion, the emotional weight of losing everything all at once. But as the realization settled in, there was no denying it anymore. Sitting alone in a small bathroom that didn't feel like home, she stared at the result in her hands, her mind racing through possibilities she wasn't prepared for. Just days earlier, her life had already fallen apart. Now it was changing again in a way she couldn't control. The silence around her felt overwhelming, pressing in as the weight of the truth sank deeper. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every decision she made from that moment forward would shape not only her future, but someone else's as well. She thought about Daniel Carter, about the life he had walked away from without hesitation, about the way he had reduced their marriage to something disposable. He didn't know. He had no idea that while he was closing one chapter of his life, another had already begun without him. Tell him, or disappear forever? The question stayed with her, growing heavier with every passing hour. Telling him would mean reopening a door she had just forced herself to close. It would tie her back to a man who had made it clear she no longer belonged in his world. It would mean placing control of something deeply personal into the hands of someone who had already proven how easily he could walk away. But disappearing came with its own consequences. It meant facing everything alone, building a life from nothing while carrying a responsibility that would never fade. Emily didn't make the decision quickly. She sat with it, turning it over in her mind, weighing fear against instinct, pain against possibility. And in the quiet moments, when the doubt was loudest, something inside her became clear. This was her choice to make, not his. not anyone else's. For the first time since the divorce, she wasn't reacting to what had been taken from her. She was deciding what came next. She made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Emily Harper chose silence, and with that choice came a reality that tested her in ways she could never have imagined. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, far from the glass towers and quiet luxury she once called home. The space was modest, barely enough for her and the life she was about to bring into the world. But it was hers, and that mattered more than anything now. She built her days around survival, taking whatever work she could find. Long shifts that left her exhausted but determined. Waitressing during the day, cleaning offices at night, and in between trying to hold on to the strength she needed to keep going. Money was always tight. Every dollar had a purpose, every expense carefully measured. There were nights she sat at the small kitchen table counting what she had left, calculating how far it could stretch, knowing there was no one else to rely on if it ran out. But even in the middle of that uncertainty, something began to shift. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the pressure felt less overwhelming, Emily found herself baking. It started as a way to clear her mind, something simple she could control when everything else felt unpredictable. But over time, it became more than that. It became an opportunity. When her daughter was born, everything changed again. Emily held her for the first time and felt a kind of clarity she hadn't known before. She named her Lily, and in that moment, the fear that had followed her through the months gave way to something stronger. Responsibility, yes, but also purpose. Lily depended on her completely, and that truth became the foundation of every decision she made moving forward. There was no room for hesitation anymore, no space for doubt that would slow her down. She worked harder than she ever had before, balancing jobs while slowly turning her late-night baking into something more. What started as small orders from neighbors grew into steady requests, then into something that resembled a real business. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen quickly, but step by step, she began to rebuild what she had lost. Not the life she once had, but something entirely her own, something earned. While Daniel Carter was building an empire, she was building a life. What started as survival became something bigger. Emily Harper didn't notice the shift at first because it didn't arrive all at once. It came in small moments, a few extra orders, a recommendation from a satisfied customer, a message from someone who had seen her work and wanted the same care and attention for their own event. The late nights in her kitchen slowly turned into structured plans, and the scattered requests became consistent demand. She began to see that what she was building wasn't temporary. It had potential. With time, she took a risk and leaned into it fully. She saved enough to move into a slightly larger space, one that allowed her to work more efficiently while still caring for Lily. She learned quickly, adapting to challenges without waiting for perfect conditions. Social media became a tool she used carefully, sharing her work in a way that drew attention without revealing too much of her personal life. People responded. They saw the detail, the effort, the consistency, and they trusted it. What began with baking expanded into full event planning, and Emily found herself stepping into a role she had never imagined but handled with natural confidence. Respect followed. Not the kind that comes from association or status, but the kind that is earned through consistency and results. Clients valued her not because of who she was connected to, but because of what she delivered. She built a reputation quietly but firmly, creating experiences that stood out, that people remembered, that brought more opportunities her way. Independence replaced the uncertainty she once lived with, and for the first time in years, she felt in control of her own direction. Lily grew alongside her, becoming the center of everything Emily worked for. Every long day, every decision, every risk taken was tied to the life she was building for her daughter. It wasn't easy, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. And then, fate brought them back together. The meeting had already started by the time Daniel Carter walked into the boardroom, his attention fixed on the conversation he had just left behind, his mind still moving at the pace of a man used to being in control of every outcome. He barely glanced at the people seated around the table, offering a quick acknowledgement before taking his place, expecting another routine discussion. another decision that would move his company forward. Across the room, Emily Harper stood with quiet confidence, her posture steady, her presence composed in a way that didn't demand attention but held it anyway. She had already begun presenting, her voice calm, measured, and certain. He didn't recognize her at first, until she spoke. Something in her voice pulled his attention away from everything else. It wasn't just familiarity, it was clarity, the kind that cuts through distraction and forces you to look again. Daniel's gaze shifted, settling on her fully for the first time, and in that moment, the room seemed to fall silent around him. The recognition didn't come gradually. It hit all at once. The woman standing in front of him, leading the room with authority and ease, was the same woman he had once dismissed, the same woman he had watched walk away with nothing. But there was nothing fragile about her now, nothing uncertain. Emily didn't pause. She didn't acknowledge the shift in his expression or the tension that had quietly filled the space. She continued speaking, moving through her presentation with precision, answering questions before they were fully asked, guiding the room with a confidence that left no room for doubt. Every word she spoke reinforced something Daniel wasn't prepared to face. She hadn't just survived. She had rebuilt, redefined, and stepped into a version of herself he had never taken the time to see. His shock was immediate, but it wasn't just about seeing her again. It was about realizing how much he had underestimated her. The assumptions he had made, the conclusions he had drawn, all of it unraveled in front of him without a single word spoken between them. She didn't need to remind him of the past. Her presence alone did that. When the meeting ended, conversations resumed, chairs shifted, and people gathered their things. But Daniel remained where he was, his focus still fixed on Emily as she calmly organized her materials. There was a distance between them now that felt larger than time itself, shaped not just by what had happened, but by everything that had changed since then. He took a step forward, as if to close that distance, but stopped when he realized something else. Emily wasn't alone. Just outside the room, visible through the glass, stood a small figure waiting patiently. A child, no more than 2 years old, holding onto the edge of a chair, watching quietly. Daniel's eyes shifted, drawn to the details he couldn't ignore. The shape of her face, the color of her eyes, the familiarity that settled in before he could stop it. But the biggest shock was still coming. Daniel Carter didn't move. For a moment, everything he had built his life around, control, certainty, logic, seemed to disappear, replaced by a single, overwhelming realization he couldn't ignore. His eyes stayed fixed on the child just beyond the glass, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing while his instincts had already reached the truth. Emily Harper followed his gaze, and for the first time since the meeting began, her composure shifted, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in acceptance of a moment she had always known would come eventually. She didn't rush to explain. She didn't step in to soften the impact. She simply stood there, allowing the silence to speak for itself. Because some truths don't need words. Some truths are undeniable the moment you see them. The daughter he never knew existed had his eyes, his smile, his blood. Daniel Carter had spent 2 years believing he had closed a chapter of his life, convinced that what he walked away from no longer mattered. He told himself it was necessary, that it was the right decision, that everything he had gained since then justified the cost. But standing there now, facing Emily Harper and the life she had built without him, that belief no longer held its weight. The success, the control, the structure he valued so deeply suddenly felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missing all along and he had only just realized it. Emily didn't say much. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be understood was already clear in the way she stood, in the quiet strength she carried, and in the child who remained close to her side. She had taken everything he left her with, which was nothing, and turned it into something meaningful, something real. Not out of revenge, not to prove a point, but because she had no other choice. And in doing so, she had created a life that didn't depend on him, a life that existed entirely on her own terms. Daniel looked at them both, the weight of his past decisions settling in fully for the first time. This wasn't about regret alone. It was about understanding what those decisions had truly cost him. Because in the moment he chose to walk away, he believed he was leaving behind a relationship that no longer worked. Something temporary, something replaceable. He thought he lost a wife, but what he really lost was a family. If you were in her position, would you have told him the truth? Would you have gone back and opened a door that once closed on you without hesitation? Or would you have chosen the same path Emily Harper did and walked away for good? It's easy to judge from the outside, to imagine what the right decision should have been, but when everything is taken from you and you're forced to rebuild from nothing, the choices don't always come with clear answers. So what would you have done? Would you have given Daniel Carter a chance to be part of that life, or protected your peace and kept moving forward without him? Let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this. And if stories like this keep you thinking long after they end, if they make you question decisions, timing, and second chances, then don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next.